All right. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you and Blake on writing a remarkable book. So I have at my nightstand about a half dozen business books at any time that are left half read because most business books should be about half the size that they are. And by the time I got done with this, it looked like my other business books had taken it outside and beaten the crap out of it. I took tons of notes. I felt like I took one of your courses after reading this. So congratulations on writing a great book.
Thanks.
So I'm going to start with an easy question, and we'll get to some hard questions. You're a digital pioneer. You build billion-dollar companies. Why write a book? Why write something on dead trees as someone who changes industries and changes the world?
Well, it's it was sort of a system of elimination. We couldn't yet figure out a better format to do this in. We had, I taught this class at Stanford. Blake took these notes in the class. He posted them on the internet. They sort of went viral. We got tons of people to read them. And then there was a question: what do you do? What do you do next? And we thought of doing sort of like a video version of it. But I don't think people actually want to watch videos because they're about a third as fast as reading. I'd much rather just read something. And then maybe you could do it as a blog, but we wanted to get everything exactly right. And then if you're going to get it exactly right, you might as well do it as a book. We initially thought of self-publishing the book and doing it all ourselves and figuring out some internet distribution channels. But then at the end we sort of became convinced it was still best to go with a big publisher. You get the imprimatur, and there'd be all these sort of subtle things that might go wrong if you self-publish. So it was a system of elimination, but we ended up with that as the idea.
Well, I think there's a lot of people, you're speaking to an audience, ideally, who needs to get on board with the future, and we read print books, so there's something there. So you write that, and you spoke to this, that monopoly is the condition of every successful business. So when I read that, I say, well, what about Coke and Pepsi? What about Adidas and Nike, Unilever and Procter & Gamble? How do you... You're anti-competition, it sounds like. How do you explain these companies that appear to be competitors and not monopolies?
Well, I think they're successful because they're less competitive than they look. I think these brands are quite powerful. Most people have a preference for either Coke or Pepsi. There aren't that many people who are completely indifferent to whether they have Coke or Pepsi. And because people are not indifferent to it, you're able to get away with a fair bit of pricing power. Branding is one of the forms monopoly takes. It's one that I generally don't invest in because I don't feel I understand how you bring it about. But it is the somewhat mysterious thing that does happen, and when it happens, it's very powerful.
So Coke has a monopoly on people who love Coke, is what you're saying?
The market is effectively kind of divided between the two of them. Otherwise, the pricing would be much cheaper.
So when you talk about competition, and you say, so Google has this monopoly on the search industry, I think there's a lot of folks out here who are working on building companies that they realize, and so in my company, we have competitors, and it feels like once you have a good idea, the competition comes out of the woodwork. And even Google, who now enjoys a monopoly, had very stiff competition in the early days. So how do you approach sort of the building of a monopoly in your definition when the reality is there is competition, that you often can't do anything about it existing?
Well, it depends a lot on the different dynamics within the markets, but ideally, you either have a technological advantage that's big enough that people can't easily replicate it. So that's always, so we often like companies where there's some real technical talent, or there's some actually pretty hard problem, because that means people cannot simply copy it. Or you have some distribution or marketing strategy where it scales very quickly, and somehow people can't replicate this. But the model I like is that you start with one other sort of contrarian insight from the monopoly perspective that leads me to a very different way of thinking about things is the convention is always that you should look at big markets. You should go after big markets. Market size is an important thing. And I always like small markets because the way if you're a startup, you start small. And a monopoly, you have a large share of the market. So how do you get to monopoly as a startup quickly? you start with a small market, and you then get to take over that market really fast. Facebook started with 10,000 people at Harvard, and it went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. And that was a very promising start. And then that could be replicated at other colleges. And then there were people who tried to copy it sort of a year later, 2 years later, but by then it had gotten a lot of traction, and it was somehow very hard to catch up.
So investors don't like to, you know this, they don't like to invest in small markets, right? So as an entrepreneur, how do you balance that? You have to paint this big vision, tell a huge story with this reality.
Or you have to show some initial traction. But yeah, I think there was certainly a bizarre Facebook prehistory where they started the company in February. I didn't get to invest in it till summer of 2004. And it is a very mysterious question still why the various investors in Boston did not give them any money. And so I think investors systematically make this sort of mistake where if you have something that has intense traction on a small market, people will often not like it. So there's a very interesting question why people in Boston all made that mistake early on with Facebook, and why, as a result, I was able to invest.
Tell us about that first meeting with Mark. I mean, we watched the movie, but we missed the part with, I think there's just you handing a check or something, right? How did that meeting, and what, was he dressed like a slob?
People ask this question all the time. There's actually nothing that interesting I have to say about it. He was very introverted. He's still kind of introverted, but he was very introverted. He didn't say very much. Sean Parker, who was played by Justin Timberlake in the movie, did a little bit more of the talking. But they had gotten a lot of traction. We'd done our homework on the company, and we gave them the $500,000 check at the end of the meeting so that they would take it from us and not from somebody else.
One of the things that I like to write about is how momentum or perceived momentum can be a stronger indicator of future success than sort of absolute success. Is that what you saw in Facebook that others didn't?
There's always, as an investor, there's always also a contrarian. The contrarian question for an investor is, what great investments is nobody making? And it's always like, why is this a good company? And then why is there a blind spot where people are missing it? And I think, so I think it was a great company because it was growing really fast. The only thing they needed money for was to buy more computers to meet the incredible demand they had at other colleges to launch. The reason why, there was, I think, several reasons people were missing it. There's probably always still a degree to which people underestimate exponential growth. Sort of the classic Einstein line that he's apocryphally said to have said that exponential growth is the most compound interest, the most powerful force in the universe. So you have something that's compounding exponentially that's very powerful and tends to get underestimated. I think the fact that it was a college site made people underestimate it because investors often like to invest in things they themselves use or understand. And since very few investors were going to college, I think they had a systematic blind spot there. So I think it's always worth asking why you have blind spots like this. And I think Facebook was probably very undervalued the first 2.5 years. They opened the site up in late 2006, and the mid 06 valuation was $550 million. The mid 07 one was $15 billion, and that was probably a full valuation when Microsoft came in.
So I was reading the book, and you'll notice that I'm wearing a startup T-shirt tonight because I read the line in the book where you said that you won't consider a founder who walks into your office and isn't wearing a startup T-shirt, something to that effect. And
first of all, this telephone game, it all gets slightly changed.
Yeah, something to that effect. First of all, I want to ask why you're not wearing a Palantir shirt tonight.
Well, I think there are no hard and fast sartorial rules, but it's always, I think if you're trying to promote a book in New York City, you want to sort of look like an author, and that's what I'm trying to look like tonight.
It's working. Yeah.
I think that if you're pitching a startup in Silicon Valley, if you wear a suit, it looks like you're bad at sales and worse at tech. So that's a bad combination.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, you talk about almost how a great startup in the early days is almost like a cult. I have a friend who's one of the early employees at Facebook who he listed out his life's priorities in a blog post, and it was Facebook, myself, my family. And that was his list of priorities, that he would take a bullet for Facebook before like his own brother. So you talk about this idea of building a cult at a startup, and I think the PayPal mafia, everyone talks about the places where all these guys have gone and the companies they've built. When you built that team, what were you looking for? What did you see? How did you curate that group? And what did you go through together to get to the point where these people could all go on and build successful companies?
Well, it's not quite a cult, and you don't quite want to have a mafia either. So these are, but I think you do. I do think there's always this question of the intensity of these businesses. The thing that the normal failure mode in startups is, it's way before the external competitors destroy you. The standard failure mode is internal. It's the people don't get along, and basically, and so one of the questions I've often found to be a very good one to ask people is to ask, what's the prehistory? When did they meet? If we just met at a networking conference a week ago and we both like becoming entrepreneurs, and so we decided to join up and start a company. That sounds like, okay, I got married to the first person I met at the slot machines in Las Vegas, and you might hit the jackpot, but it's probably a really bad idea. And the good answer is more like there's a long prehistory, and we've been thinking about this for a long time. And so I do think there is sort of an intensity that when it is there is really powerful, and when it's when it's missing, you have sort of this manic depressive aspect to these startups where it's like you're going to take over the world or you're all going to get destroyed, and you go from one extreme to the other several times a day. And if you don't have things working well internally, the companies tend to blow up.
So I use this analogy a lot when I talk to other entrepreneurs that are starting companies, that you wouldn't start a rock band with 4 guitarists. And that's a lot of times what people do, especially in business school. They get their 4 business buddies with MBAs and they go start a company. You came from law. You grabbed Reed from poli-sci or something, and several dudes from various Soviet countries, and you assembled this team that was a fairly motley crew. What about these people made what you made so special?
Well, there was a longer history. So Reed joined a little bit later, but there's a group of us that were friends from Stanford. There was a group of us that were friends from University of Illinois, and there was sort of a way in which we had known each other for some time before we teamed up. There was, we were, I don't know, we liked. I don't know. It was very focused on getting a. And then you do sort of form a team. The question, when I worked in a big law firm in a big bank in New York, one of the dynamics I always disliked was that all the people that you were really competing against were the people right next to you, and so there was sort of no fundamentally friendly people around. All the people around were structurally hostile. You started a law firm, there are 80 people. Coming in, 5 will make partner after 8 years, and it's you against all of the people who you're sort of interchangeable with, and banks are very similar to that. And the goal that Max and I had when we started PayPal was we wanted to create a company where there would be some incredibly strong friendships that would be formed, we thought that. And so the question was, and so the question was, we didn't hire only our friends, but it was, could we be friends with these people? And that turned out to be a sort of, and this is sort of where it's beyond. It's what I describe as something you want to always move beyond professionalism. You don't want to be, sort of a law firm I remember interviewing with. One of the partners told me all the partners hated one another, and they still made a lot of money because it was such a professional place. And I think you want to have something that's more than just professional.
That's, yeah, okay. Well, so I mean, at Contently, this strange phenomenon I have, we're about 65 people now, and I've noticed that our employees get up and leave on Friday afternoons and go to the bar together without me, and it's a strange feeling, but it's kind of, you feel almost like a proud parent, like, hey, they love each other, even though, you know, that we're just paying their salaries, and so there's something nice to that idea.
One of the rules one of the sort of rules I heard, which I haven't checked whether it's true, but sounded plausible, was that if you have 3 really good friends at the company you're working at, you're likely to stay there indefinitely. If you have 0 really good friends at the company you're working at, you're at very high risk of turnover. Yeah. So I do think these things are very underexplored.
So here's a hard question. Star Trek or Star Wars?
Oh, that's easy. Star Wars, no question. It's like you know.
Well,
we had.
You talk about this in the book, actually.
Well, we had you know, if you're starting a payments company like PayPal, you have, you know, Star Wars. The whole plot line is about Han Solo trying to get the money to pay off you know, to pay off some of the debts he has. So it's about, the money thing is like an essential plot element. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Star Trek you have the transporter device that can transform anything into anything. And so it's a world where there is seemingly no scarcity and no money, and it's only mentally deranged people in the Star Trek universe who want to have money. So, you know, that's...
And Star Wars is a very competitive environment, right? So that...
Well, it's you know, you have to be careful not to push the analogies too far.
We can move on, okay. So you talk a surprising amount in the book about political issues. For a business book, I found a surprising amount. So I've had this dream for a while, ever since I saw a news report of a guy that built a floating island out of water bottles off the coast of Cancun and floated away, and no one heard from him again. I've had this dream of building a floating city. And I've heard that you've harbored similar ideas. So the question is, if you had a floating city and you could start a government anew, what would you do with that government starting fresh that you couldn't be able to do now, say, in Silicon Valley?
Well, I mean, it's almost like what are you allowed to do? I don't know. I think that I do think the seasteading floating city project. I was friends with Milton Friedman. It came to me from his grandson, Patrick Friedman, and it was sort of the small side project we got involved with over the years that always generates like an almost embarrassing amount of intensity. Of interest. And I think it gets a lot of interest because there's a sense that there's no frontier left. There's no place that you can go. Every part of this planet's surface is, land surface is covered by political entities of one sort or another. You know, outer space is probably still a little bit too far away for the time being. And so even though the seasteading thing is sort of a somewhat far-fetched project, it captures a lot of, gets a lot of discussion going because there is this sense that that we're living in a more ossified, more bureaucratic society where there are a lot of rules and there are a lot of things you can't do. And I think probably the one, you know, the political issue that I'm always the most concerned about is whether we are having enough technological innovation as a society. I think that in many areas, there are way too many restrictions that stop us from innovating quickly. The world of bits, of computers, is mostly unregulated. The world of atoms is heavily regulated. You know, if you got the polio vaccine today, you would not be able to get it approved. And so I think that there are a lot of biomedical areas where I think we're doing much less well than we could be.
So you think perhaps a floating island where there'd be more medical experimentation allowed?
I think there would be way more allowed, yes.
Yes. So speaking of space, in the last chapter, so I was tickled when I came to the part in your book about 10x thinking, because the last chapter of my book is actually called 10x thinking. And it's the story of Elon Musk at SpaceX when they nearly lost the company. And basically the story goes that they Elon at some point told his employees, I have enough money for 3 rockets. 2 rockets failed, the 3rd rocket failed, and everyone kind of panicked, and then he, surprise, had obtained an investment from someone, a benefactor or an investor that saved the company, and now they were the first private space company to reach orbit. They're reducing the cost to go to space by orders of magnitude. Tell us about being on the other side of, that's a crazy vision. Elon says he wants to die on Mars. And you knew him, but being on the other side of that as an investor, tell us about that story of the calculus that you had looking at that scenario.
Well, we invested in SpaceX in summer of 2008, and the 2 rockets had blown up. It was a very contrarian investment because nobody was investing in rocket companies. There were, in fact, no one had any expertise in investing in rocket companies. There had been no rocket companies started in 40 years or so of any significance, and so it was definitely very far outside the fashionable zone. But then when you actually looked at the business, the fundamentals of the business are quite good. It was one where you got paid in advance for your rocket, so it actually generates positive cash flow very quickly. They had actually quite a bit more runway than just 1 rocket. So they had, they'd gotten, there was this guy in DARPA who really liked Elon, and even though DARPA was not allowed to fund research into rockets, he just ordered rockets one after another, and then if it failed, he just bought another rocket. He wasn't funding the research. And so there was, we thought they had probably 4 or 5 tries left at that point.
The press story was that they're crazy, but behind the scenes, it was actually a very good business, you're saying.
It was, once we looked at it carefully, it was a much better business than even we had thought. And certainly we had a few of our LPs, LPs who had not invested in Founders Fund, voluntarily wrote us and told us that this was the dumbest investment they had ever seen. And if you know how risk-averse the limited partners who tend to run these fund-to-funds that invest in these venture funds are, for them to voluntarily say that it's a dumb idea, they have to be convinced it's just an unbelievably stupid idea.
Which for an investor like you must be music to your ears.
No, it's not. It's always, you want to be contrarian and right. It's most of the time, Look, I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I believe the Earth goes around the sun. Most things, I think, most conventional truths are just true.
So speaking of math, the 10x thinking thing I think is real interesting. Astro Teller of Google X says that it's easier to build a business that's 10 times bigger than just 10%, or 10 times better than 10% better. And you talk about how if you want to obtain a monopoly, you should do something that's 10 times better than just 2 times better. But the question that when I tell entrepreneurs this, people get excited, very excited about this idea, but the question always is how? How do you do something 10 times better than what everyone else is struggling to improve on?
Well, it has to be on some relevant metrics. So for example, you could say, and it's sort of a rule of thumb, but the intuition is that if it's 20%, 30% better, it's not enough to really convince people to change their behavior, because it's always technology plus the sale of technology, and the sale of technology, people don't like change. Change polls very, very poorly in our society, and so to actually induce people to change what they're doing, it has to be something that just feels dramatically different, dramatically better. I would say Amazon. It was when Amazon started as an online bookseller, they had more than 10 times as many books available as any bookstore in the U.S. That's sort of it's a sort of banal version of it, but you just have sort of 10 times in terms of diversity. PayPal, when we started, you could say that the alternative was writing checks on eBay, which took 7 to 10 days to cash, versus getting the money within instantaneously or within a few hours. And so I think there are sort of all these different ways things do. I think, you know, an innovation like the iPhone, you know, where maybe it's just like you define an iPhone as a smartphone that just works. That's like maybe infinitely times better since there's nothing at all.
Hundreds of thousands of apps that you can add onto it. So they're flagging us down on time, but I have one more question from a student. So we had students come up with some questions and picked a couple, but the one that I wanted to ask you is, speaking of Elon Musk, says Elon Musk decided in college that he wanted to change 3 industries that were important problems: the internet, space, and energy. And so the question for you is, if you were sitting in one of these seats and about to exit college and going to start a company, what industry would you want to change? What problem would you work on?
You know, I'm going to resist answering it on quite that level, because I think I never like thematic answers where it's industries or sectors, because when they're that big, there's too much going on in it. So you know, I do think there are. I'd like us to be working a lot more on the energy side. I'd like us to be working a lot more on you know, biomedical research in various ways. But it's I always like to push back against framing it that abstractly. You know, the great companies always have a certain particularity to them where the problem is almost the same side. You know, there's a search problem, but search is really Google, or there's a, you know, social networking in some sense is coeval with Facebook. I mean, there's some other social networking companies at this point, but it's often a mistake to think of it on that level. Whereas, and so, you know, the problems people often talk about today that I'm perhaps the most skeptical, where it's most often framed in this abstract way, are education and healthcare IT, where and you know, where I think, you know, I think people broadly agree there's a lot that's somewhat off, and you have ideas about how to fix it, but if you frame it as an education startup or a healthcare IT startup, that's slightly too abstract, and it's always sort of a much more granular, much more specific kind of a framing. You know, the area that I'm most passionate about as an area sort of both of science and then shading into technology is the question of whether we can do things to work on longevity. You know, one out of almost all diseases people suffer from are linked to aging. At age 30, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting cancer in your next year. At age 80, you have a 1 in 10 chance. And so I do think we could be doing a lot more on studying aging, understanding why it happens, understanding the causes, slowing it down, and possibly reversing it. And so, but that's again sort of maybe too broad a theme, even though it's something I'm very passionate about.
Maybe someone in this audience will take a very small piece of that, build a monopoly, read the book, and then
even a small piece of that would be worth a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Peter. This has been fantastic, and again, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Shane and Peter. Give a big round of applause.